Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Ben Lawson had always believed he knew his wife. After 8 years of marriage, he thought he'd figured out every nuance of Claire's behavior, every little habit, every predictable pattern. Friday nights were sacred to her, a ritual Ben not only tolerated but actively encouraged. Claire would leave around 7:30, always smelling nice, always in good spirits, to meet her 3 best friends from high school. They'd have dinner, drink wine, laugh late into the night, and catch up on each other's lives. Claire usually came home after midnight, slightly tipsy, full of stories about her friends' dramas, about who was dating, who'd fought with her husband, the endless gossip that Ben listened to patiently while making her chamomile tea. Ben liked this arrangement. He thought it was healthy for Claire to maintain her friendships, to have a life beyond their marriage. He himself used those evenings to watch basketball games, eat pizza straight from the box, and do all the things Claire considered uncivilized. It was a perfect balance, or so he'd thought. That Friday in November started like any other. Ben woke up early, went to the gym, came back to work from home while Claire was at the office. He was a systems analyst and worked remotely 3 days a week, a privilege he especially appreciated on cold days like this one. The afternoon was clear but freezing, the kind of day that called for hot coffee and a blanket. Ben decided to do something thoughtful. Claire had been complaining that her car was messy, full of snack wrappers and scattered work papers. He thought he'd clean it as a surprise, leaving everything spotless for when she returned from girls' night. He started in the back seat, picking up empty shopping bags, some old magazines, and a broken umbrella Claire had sworn she'd fix. When he moved the passenger seat forward to vacuum better, something white caught his eye. It was a piece of paper wedged between the seat and the center console. Ben pulled it out. A parking receipt, crumpled but still legible. The date was from the previous Friday, right during Claire's supposed girls' night. But the address wasn't any downtown restaurant or bar where Claire always said she met her friends. It was a residential address in the city's southern zone, a neighborhood Ben only vaguely knew, an area of new, expensive condominiums. Ben stared at the receipt for a long moment, his brain trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe the girls had changed locations. Maybe one of them lived at that address and they decided to meet at home. But something didn't add up. Claire always talked about the restaurants and bars they visited, mentioning specific names. Why would she lie about where they were meeting? A strange feeling began to form in Ben's stomach, something between discomfort and fear. He wasn't the jealous type, he never had been. But that receipt seemed wrong, out of place, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit into the picture he thought he knew. Ben went back inside, still holding the receipt, the vacuum cleaner forgotten in the open trunk. He checked the clock. Claire was still at the office, she wouldn't be back before 6. He had time. Without thinking much, acting on an impulse he didn't fully understand himself, Ben went upstairs to the bedroom. Claire's laptop was on the desk, exactly where she always left it. He knew the password, it was their wedding anniversary, she'd never kept it a secret. Ben opened the computer, his hands trembling slightly. He felt dirty doing this, invading her privacy, but something stronger pushed him forward. He needed to know. He needed to understand that receipt. Her email was open, logged in automatically. Ben started scrolling through messages, not sure exactly what he was looking for. Newsletters, promotions, a few exchanges with coworkers about projects. Nothing unusual. He was about to give up, feeling foolish for doubting her, when he saw a name he didn't recognize, Marcos Vidal. The messages were scattered, hidden among dozens of others. Ben clicked on the first one. There wasn't much text, but enough. "See you Friday," said one. "I can't wait," replied another. "That bottle of wine you like," added a third. The messages were from 3 weeks ago, all sent on Thursdays, always the day before girls' night. Ben felt the air leave his lungs. He clicked on another, older message. Last night was incredible. I can still smell your perfume on the sheets. Ben slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing in the empty room. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. The messages left no doubt. Claire was having an affair. And the address on the receipt, that condo in the south, was where she met him. There was no girls' night. There hadn't been one, at least not recently. It was all a lie. Ben stumbled downstairs, feeling physically ill. He leaned against the kitchen counter, trying to steady his breathing. Part of him wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, that there was a reasonable explanation. But the rational part knew the truth. The messages were too clear, too intimate. And the receipt proved Claire had been at that address. He checked the clock again. 3:30 in the afternoon. Claire would be home in 2.5 hours, would get ready, and leave for another girls' night that would actually be a rendezvous with Marcos Vidal. Ben felt anger begin to replace the shock, not explosive anger, but something cold and focused. He wasn't going to let this continue. He wasn't going to be made a fool of again. Ben grabbed his phone and looked up the address from the receipt. It was a condo complex called Riverside Gardens, modern and discreet. He opened Google Maps and memorized the location. Then he did something he never imagined he'd do. He called a car rental agency and reserved a vehicle for that afternoon. He couldn't use his own car. Claire would recognize it immediately. He needed something anonymous, inconspicuous. When Claire got home at 6, Ben was in the living room, apparently calm, watching the news. She kissed him on the cheek, as always, commented on the awful traffic, as always. She went upstairs to shower, as always. Ben watched it all with a strange detachment, as if he were watching a play whose script he knew but whose actors didn't. At 7, Claire came downstairs already dressed. A dark blue dress, the one Ben always said looked beautiful on her. Medium heels, carefully applied makeup. Perfume. That expensive perfume he'd given her for her birthday 3 months earlier. Ben felt a bitter pang of irony. He'd paid for the perfume she wore to meet another man. "I'm off, love," Claire said, grabbing her purse. "The girls are probably already at the restaurant. I'll be back around midnight, okay?" "Okay," Ben replied, his voice neutral. "Have fun. Drive carefully." Claire smiled, waved, and left. Ben waited until he heard her car pull out of the garage, drive down the street, and disappear around the corner. Then he stood up, grabbed the keys to the rental car he'd parked 2 blocks away, and followed her. Traffic was moderate for a Friday night. Ben kept a safe distance, always 2 or 3 cars behind. Claire drove confidently, unhurried, clearly used to this route. As he suspected, she didn't head downtown, where the restaurants and bars she always mentioned were located. She headed south, straight toward the address on the receipt. 20 minutes later, Claire pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Gardens. Ben drove past, parked across the street at a spot with a clear view of the building's entrance. His heart raced now, adrenaline coursing through his body. Part of him still hoped he was wrong, that Claire would get out of the car and explain this was all a ridiculous misunderstanding. But that's not what happened. Ben watched Claire get out of the car, check her appearance in the rearview mirror, and adjust her hair. Then she walked toward the building's entrance, where a man waited in the lobby. He was tall, dark-haired, around 40, wearing jeans and a casual but clearly expensive shirt. When Claire reached him, the man smiled and opened his arms. And they kissed. It wasn't a greeting kiss. It was long, intimate, the kind that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Ben felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. Seeing it was different from knowing. Reading the messages was one thing, but witnessing the kiss, seeing how easily Claire surrendered to that man's arms, was something else entirely. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The couple walked into the building, hand in hand. Ben waited 5 minutes, trying to control his breathing, trying to decide what to do. The rational part told him to leave, hire a lawyer, handle this civilly. But the wounded, betrayed, humiliated part couldn't just turn around, not after seeing that. Ben got out of the car and crossed the street. The condo had a doorman at the front desk, an older man who looked at him with professional courtesy. Ben improvised quickly. "Good evening. I'm visiting a friend, Marcos Vidal. Does he live here?" The doorman checked a list. "Apartment 408. But he didn't tell me he was expecting anyone." Ben forced a smile. "It's a surprise. His birthday. Can I go up?" The doorman hesitated, but something in Ben's face, maybe the mix of determination and desperation, convinced him. "All right, but if he calls to complain, I'll have to ask you to leave." "He won't call," Ben said, already heading for the elevator. The fourth floor was quiet, thick carpet muffling all sound. Ben found apartment 408 at the end of the hallway. He stopped in front of the door, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. For a moment, he considered just walking away. But then he remembered the kiss, how easily Claire had lied that night and all the nights before. He remembered their 8 years of marriage, the trust he'd placed in her. Ben rang the doorbell. No answer. He rang again, more insistently this time, holding the button down for several seconds. Finally, he heard hurried footsteps from the other side. The door opened a crack, and Claire's face appeared, at first annoyed at being interrupted, then frozen in shock when she recognized who was standing there. "Ben?" Her voice came out as a strangled whisper. "What, how did you?" Ben didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed the door open calmly but firmly and stepped inside the apartment. Claire stepped back, eyes wide, face pale as paper. In the living room, Marcos Vidal stood up, wearing only jeans, clearly panicked, trying to make sense of what was happening. Ben looked around the apartment. It was modern, minimalist, decorated with expensive taste. An open bottle of wine sat on the coffee table, 2 half-filled glasses. The lighting was low, romantic. A jazz playlist played softly in the background. The whole scene screamed intimacy, planning, routine. "Nice place," Ben said, his voice eerily calm. He looked at Marcos. "You must be Marcos Vidal. Pilates instructor, right? I read your emails." Marcos turned even paler. Claire stepped forward, hands trembling. "Ben, I can explain, I swear I can." "Can you?" Ben cut her off, finally looking directly at her. "Can you explain how you've looked me in the eyes every Friday for the past 2 years and lied? Can you explain how you made up detailed stories about your friends, about restaurants, about conversations that never happened?" 2 years? Claire repeated, her voice breaking. "No, Ben, it wasn't 2 years, Don't lie anymore," Ben interrupted, his voice hard. "I found the parking receipt. I read the messages. I tracked the patterns. Every Friday for at least 2 years, sometimes more often, while I stayed home like a complete idiot, making tea for when you got back, listening to your elaborate lies about your friends, you were here." Marcos tried to intervene, his voice tense. "Look, man, I didn't know she was married until..." Ben laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Don't lie to me too, Marcos. I saw the messages. You two laughed at me more than once." Ben's so clueless, he never suspects a thing. Was it fun? Making fun of the dumb husband? The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Claire now had tears streaming down her face, but Ben felt no compassion. He pulled his phone from his pocket and unlocked the screen. "You know, Marcos, I spent the afternoon doing a little research on you. Found some interesting things." Ben scrolled through his phone with deliberate calm. "You give private Pilates lessons to several wealthy clients. Very convenient. And this apartment? It's not yours, is it? It's provided by the gym where you work, part of your benefits package. The owner is a Mr. Patterson, right? Marcos stood completely still. Ben continued, each word measured and cold. I'm sure Mr. Patterson would love to know that the apartment he generously provides you is being used for extramarital affairs with clients. I bet that violates a few clauses in your contract. You can't do that, Marcos said, but his voice was weak, unconvincing. I can and I will, Ben replied simply. He finally looked at Claire again. And you, I called your friends today. Yes, all three. Jennifer, Paula, and Sarah. It was a very enlightening conversation. Claire closed her eyes, as if she knew what was coming. None of them had any idea you supposedly met every Friday. In fact, Jennifer was pretty offended. Said it's been months since you've replied to her messages, that you disappeared from their group chat after you got your new job. Interesting, isn't it? You abandoned your real friends to have the perfect excuse to cheat on your husband. Ben slowly walked toward the door, each step echoing in the tense silence of the apartment. When he reached the threshold, he turned one last time. I've already called my lawyer. He's waiting for my call tomorrow morning to start divorce proceedings. Your things will be packed and waiting in the garage when you get home, if you even come back. Honestly, I don't care. Claire finally found her voice, desperate. Ben, please, we can talk about this at home, calmly, we can try to work it out. Work it out? Ben repeated, the word heavy with disbelief. Claire, there's nothing to work out. You chose to do this. You chose to betray me repeatedly. You chose to lie to me for 2 years. Those were your choices. Now I'm making mine. I'm choosing dignity and moving on. He opened the door fully. As for the division of assets, you'll find that proven marital infidelity isn't exactly favorable in divorce proceedings. Especially when I have all the necessary evidence, messages, receipts, photos. Oh yes, I took pictures of you two kissing at the building entrance. Very useful for court. Marcos finally exploded. What kind of person spies and takes pictures? That's sick. Ben looked at him with icy contempt. The kind of person who found out his wife was cheating. The kind who won't just sit back and be made a fool of. And before you make more of a scene, Marcos, I suggest you call your wife. Oh, you didn't know I knew? Yeah. You're married too. Juliana, right? Nice woman, I saw her photos on your Facebook before you made it private. I'm sure she'll love to hear what you've been up to on Friday nights. Whatever color remained in Marcos's face vanished completely. Ben allowed himself a cold smile. You thought I'd come here without doing my homework? I'm a systems analyst, Marcos. Research is literally part of my job. I found everything, your social media, your home address, your wife's name, even where your kids go to school. Don't worry, I won't involve the children. But Juliana? She has every right to know. Ben looked at them one last time. Claire was sobbing now, leaning against the wall, shoulders shaking. Marcos had sunk onto the couch, head in his hands. They looked shattered, scared, exposed. Ben felt no pity. He felt only a cold emptiness where love and trust used to be. You two deserve each other, he said, his voice low but clear. Two people who lie so easily, who betray without remorse. I hope it's worth it. I hope that expensive wine and those secret nights are worth the marriages you've destroyed. He left, closing the door gently behind him. The sound of the elevator bell echoed down the hallway as he called for it. Ben went downstairs, past the doorman who watched him curiously, and stepped out into the cold night air. He took a deep breath, feeling the oxygen burn his lungs. His hand still trembled, adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but there was something else too. Clarity. Resolve. For the first time in hours, he knew exactly what he needed to do. In the weeks that followed, Claire's life methodically fell apart. Ben hadn't been bluffing about the evidence. He'd documented everything with surgical precision, every message, every receipt, every behavioral pattern. His lawyer built a solid case that left little room for negotiation. Claire tried to argue for an equitable division of assets, but the evidence of prolonged infidelity and the use of marital funds to support the affair worked strongly against her. The apartment they'd lived in was in Ben's name, purchased with money he'd inherited from his grandfather. Their joint savings were divided, but Ben managed to keep most of it based on the demonstrated bad faith. Claire received no alimony, as both were employed and there were no children involved. She had to move into a small apartment across town, a place that barely fit her furniture. Marcos lost his job when Mr. Patterson found out about the inappropriate use of the company-provided apartment. The gym had a clear policy on professional conduct, and relationships with clients were strictly forbidden. Several of his private clients canceled their sessions when they heard the story. Word spread quickly in that tight-knit social circle. Juliana, his wife, immediately filed for divorce and obtained a temporary restraining order while proceedings were underway. She also requested substantial child support for herself and their 2 children. Claire's real friends, the ones she'd abandoned, heard the story through Jennifer, whom Ben had contacted. None of them ever spoke to Claire again. The sense of betrayal was twofold. Claire had not only used their names as cover for her infidelity but had also pushed them out of her life without explanation, replacing real friendships with convenient lies. 4 months after the confrontation, the divorce was finalized. Ben kept the apartment, sold all the furniture that held too many memories, and redecorated completely. He started therapy, not because he was emotionally destroyed, but because he wanted to understand how he'd been so blind, how he'd missed the signs. His therapist helped him process not just the betrayal but also the anger he directed at himself for having trusted so deeply. Ben also began reconnecting with friends he'd neglected during the marriage. He realized he'd gradually isolated himself, always prioritizing time with Claire, adjusting his life around her schedule and preferences. Now, he had freedom to accept last-minute invitations, to travel without checking with anyone, to simply exist without constantly considering another person. 6 months after the divorce, Ben was reading in a cafe when a woman bumped into his table, spilling his coffee. She apologized profusely and insisted on buying him another. Her name was Sophie, and she taught literature at a private school. They talked for 20 minutes, then for an hour. She mentioned she'd also recently gone through a divorce and understood how hard it was to trust again. "But I think the secret," Sophie said, stirring her cappuccino, "is not letting what happened turn you bitter. The person who betrayed me doesn't define who I am. And definitely doesn't define who I'll become." Ben smiled, a real smile, for the first time in months. They exchanged numbers. They started meeting for coffee, then dinner, then long Sunday walks in the park. Sophie had a clear rule from the beginning: absolute honesty, even when it hurt. Ben couldn't have agreed more. A year later, Ben was in his renovated apartment, cooking dinner for Sophie and a few friends. He looked around at the new paintings on the walls, the furniture he'd chosen himself, the plants Sophie had insisted would bring the place to life. There were no traces of Claire left. There was no pain when he thought of her, only a distant memory of a life that was no longer his. His phone buzzed. A message from Sophie saying she was on her way and would bring that wine he liked. Ben smiled as he read it, but this time there were no hidden meanings, no lies beneath the surface. It was exactly what it appeared to be, a simple gesture of affection from someone he was learning to love again. Ben realized then that Claire hadn't just taken 8 years of his life. She'd inadvertently given him something unexpected, the certainty that he deserved better. The understanding that trust wasn't naivety, but a conscious choice that should be honored. And the courage to start over, not as a broken man, but as someone who'd survived, learned, and grown stronger. The doorbell rang. Ben went to answer it, leaving the past where it belonged, firmly behind him, and embracing a future that finally seemed bright and honest. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.